Greetings to all and welcome to today's panel discussion with leaders of the canonization cause for Dorothy Day. I'm David Mueller, the coordinator of the Dorothy Day Canonization Prayer Network. I serve on the advisory committee of the Dorothy Day Guild, and as well, I'm the volunteer education coordinator of Casa Esther Catholic Worker House in Ahern, Wisconsin, from which I'm broadcasting today. This is the first public discussion to learn about the steps involved with Day's path to officially being recognized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Day is viewed by us and many as already being a saint, but we desire to share this with the entire mystical body of Christ, both now and for all generations to come, hence our support for this cause. I would like to begin today with a meditation about saints in Dorothy's own words, and this will be immediately followed by a 3-minute trailer of filmmaker Martin Doblmeier's 2020 documentary, Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day story. And afterwards, we'll begin our discussion. From Dorothy Day's writings. The saints were those who knew how to love, whose lives were transformed by love. The deep desire in the heart of every one of us is to love in such a way that things become new, that there is a new song in our hearts. St. Augustine says we must learn to love everyone as though we loved that one person alone, most particularly in the world. And St. Paul says we're all called to be saints. All through the lives of the saints, there is this laying down of life, not the taking of it, this forgiveness with no thought of revenge, this overwhelming love that overcomes fear, this loving to folly, the folly of the cross.
In many ways, Dorothy Day was a typical grandmother.
I see my grandmother as someone who was very ordinary, but also very extraordinary. I mean, I understood that she was different.
Different because Dorothy Day was so often on the front lines, protesting war and nuclear buildup, creating houses of hospitality for the hungry and homeless, and earning her place on the FBI watch list as a dangerous American.
Yeah, Dorothy Day is a big troublemaker.
As a young journalist, Dorothy Day campaigned for those in need.
Her work keeps putting her front and center in the social movements of the time.
She wrote about workers' rights, child labor. She was attracted to communism, believing it was a way to improve people's lives, all part of a chapter in her own life that would leave its scars. But with the birth of her daughter, Dorothy Day turned from communism and converted to the Catholic faith. There, she discovered a path that for nearly a half-century led her to become one of the greatest champions for the poor America has ever known.
She thought if communism is radical, why shouldn't Christianity be radical? This is radical.
My grandmother always said that she never meant to start houses of hospitality. She never meant to open up soup lines. But what happens when you start writing about these things, people show up at the door.
She wanted the people to exercise their own sense of personal responsibility. You see something that needs to be done, you do it.
But accepting the biblical challenge to be peacemakers also compelled her to become a pacifist without compromise, to use her Catholic worker movement and the newspaper she founded to resist America's intervention in any war. Many believed her behavior was un-American.
She did describe herself as an anarchist.
There's an anarchist dimension to her Christian witness.
Some of the most profound and most rewarding demonstrations that culminated in arrests were with the Catholic worker community.
I think of Dorothy Day as a firecracker that never goes out.
Now this grandmother and anarchist may well be declared a saint.
We'd love to see Dorothy made a saint.
For both American middle-class people and for Catholics, they recognized that something extraordinary was going on. They weren't quite sure what to do with it.
She annoyed people. because she challenged him.
She would say, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be written off that easily."
Well, I think if you take the Lord's words, you'll find they're pretty rigorous. The Sermon on the Mount may be read with great enjoyment, but when it comes to practicing it, it really is an examination of conscience to see how far we go.
So now let's begin our panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Kevin Ahern. Kevin is an author, an editor, and he is an associate professor of religious studies at Manhattan College. From 2017 to 2021, he also served as the president of the International Catholic Movement for Intellectual and Cultural Affairs. Kevin was recently elected by the advisory committee of the Dorothy Day Guild to serve as its co-chair along with Deidre Cornell. Kevin, welcome.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you for putting this event together. I see in the chat some many friends and many people who have been involved in the work of the Guild and in the work of the worker and people who have journeyed with Dorothy over the years. So it's wonderful to see many people and many friends with us today. We have two people who have been busy at work and the cause for Dorothy Day's canonization at two different levels in two different time zones. We have Emanuele Spedicato, who is a lecturer in the Faculty of Canon Law at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He's the external collaborator and assistant to Waldemar Hilgemann, who's the postulator for the cause. We also have here George Horton, the Director of Social and Community Development at Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese of New York. George has been the vice-postulator for the cause and has been shepherding along the work in the diocesan phase, as well as coordinating the Dorothy Day Guild. So we have two experts with us today. We have a series of questions we'll put to them, and in a little while, I think also Emanuele has a presentation for us to show us. And as we go along, I think some of you may have questions. We'll leave room at the end for questions where you can vocalize them. But if you have questions you want to put in the chat or responses to put in the chat, we certainly encourage that and would welcome that. And as I often tell my students, if there are sometimes tangents are good tangents for conversations. So we have two initial questions I wanted to begin with. So let me begin with you, Emanuele, since you're traveling across the ocean here for our conversation today. How did you get involved in the work of promoting saints? How did you get involved in this work, and when did you first hear about Dorothy?
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everybody. Well, my involvement in canonization, I started with canonization like almost 10 years ago. But I was involved in Dorothy Day's cause almost 4 years ago because I'm a colleague to Dr. Hilgemann, so we used to work together with many cases. And at some point he said, "Do you know Dorothy Day?" And at that point, it was just a name to me. I heard about her. But when he asked me this question, I said, well, I know some about her. And he said, will you be willing to be involved in this case? And that was really an honor to me. So that's when I started to get involved into this process, this big process.
Great. And George, how did you get involved in this cause?
Well, thank you, Kevin. I had worked for Catholic. I'm finishing 41 years in Catholic Charities, and I was the social action director for Catholic Charities. And Cardinal O'Connor, responding to the message out there that people were interested in pursuing the canonization of Dorothy Day, asked me to bring together people who knew her. And there were a couple of meetings with Cardinal O'Connor, and people who had worked with her, had been formed by her, loved her, wanted to support the canonization. And we came together in those early meetings. And what I think, first of all, I regard it as a great grace that I was asked to do this. But I think Cardinal O'Connor began with a consultation with the people who knew her, were formed by her, and asked them, do you think she should be canonized? And unanimously, the group said that he should go forward. That meeting, if we get a chance, Kevin, at some point, I'd like to tell you a little about that initial meeting, because in that initial meeting with Cardinal O'Connor, where he was asking that question, also kind of laid the groundwork for the development of the cause, but also some of the difficulties that were faced later on. So at some point, I'd like to tell you about that meeting.
Yeah, why don't you go on that, George, because that's such a wonderful story that I've heard you tell before, and I think it helps to set the stage for our conversation this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I hope everyone out there hasn't heard it before. I've kind of told it quite often, but after we invited the people to come, and the group of people that came were extraordinary people, mostly people who had worked with her, who knew her, who were her friends. I'm not sure everyone will recognize the names, but Eileen Egan was there, Nina Polson Moore, Addie Bethune, Frank Donovan, Jane Salmon, Kathleen and Patrick Jordan, Robert Ellsberg, Phil Runkle. I'm sure I'm going to leave someone out, Tom and Monica Cornell, Tom, who just passed away, God rest his soul. As I was sitting there with Cardinal O'Connor, awaiting for people to come in the room, people were filing in the room. And right from the beginning, I had this enormous sense of something very serious, very important, and very holy taking place. All of a sudden, Addie Bethune entered the room, and you could feel her presence as a strong, powerful woman. Cardinal O'Connor saw her enter, and he yelled across the room at her, Addie, do you still have your coffin in your house? Addie looked at Cardinal O'Connor, and she pointed at him with her finger, and she said, John O'Connor, you used to be an awful hawk. You've come a long way. Well, apart from saying, well, this meeting has gotten off to a good start, and wondering about that, Addie, a close friend of Dorothy, had an art school in Newport. Cardinal O'Connor was chief of naval chaplains, had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and was also stationed in Newport. They got to know each other there. Why I think that's such an iconic moment is because here are 2 perspectives on the gospel, on the church, on our life practicing the works of mercy. And they were able to relate to each other because of this underlying relationship that they shared. As this cause has progressed, there have been difficulties. But it has moved forward, I believe, because of the faith of the people that have been involved from all aspects of the church. It was a beautiful moment, and it's as if it remains in my memory like it happened yesterday. But again, I felt the grace in that room, the seriousness. Again, Cardinal O'Connor asked people, should he go forward? And they said, yes, absolutely go forward. He was consulting with them, consulting with the people.
Great, thank you. A bigger question before we get more specific into the cause for Dorothy. Why is sainthood important? And for both of you, maybe one of you could take it. Why is it important for the church to recognize in a formal way the extraordinary lives of saints among us?
You want to start?
Easy question, right, Emanuele?
George, you can go first, and then I can.
Okay. I think simply put, we need models. We need people that we can look to who bring our faith into action in our world. Dorothy's not a halo saint. One of the definitions of what the canonization process has to show is heroic virtue. And so the person who's being canonized, their life has to demonstrate the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues. Since Vatican II, there's been an emphasis on how those virtues get lived out in our lifetime. And what is the relevance to the modern world? I think we all speak about that moment when Pope Francis came to the United States and addressed the joint session of Congress, where he talked about Dorothy in the same breath that he talked about other great Americans who had an enormous impact on the life of our society, on the life of America. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton. So it's not just sanctity, but it's life lived in the world. And how does that, our virtue in the world, become a model for us? I think today, where there's so much chaos that we're living in, to have those kinds of models are pretty important. I also think wherever we can find a model that helps us to be more like Christ in how we live, and how we can, in the chaos of things, continue to see ourselves moving toward the kingdom. We have to remember sainthood isn't an honor for Dorothy Day. She doesn't need it. People regard her as a saint. It is for us, our time and the future time. Someone said to me today, she's a saint for our time, and when she's canonized, she'll be a saint for all time. I think it's important also to remember that God makes saints. But I mentioned this earlier, an important part of this is the church's recognition of something coming from the people. And again, I think Dorothy embodies that. So we need Dorothy. We need her for the times that we're living in, and the church needs her. And one of the very powerful things about Dorothy is she challenges both the church and the society to live the gospel. The church needs saints for itself as well. So I think those are some of the reasons I think about, Kevin.
Great. Emanuele?
Thank you, George. That's very powerful what you have said. And honestly, continuing what you said, the church recognizes two different levels of holiness. What the Vatican II called the universal call to holiness, which we are all called to as baptized. So we, all of us, as baptized, as Son of God and Son of Christ after baptism, are called to be saint, really. And among this universal holiness, universal call to holiness, there are some persons who are so worthy to be seen and to be recognized as models, as you said, that the church needs really those models to present as a friend. That's how we can call and we could see really a saint. A saint is a friend. In the doctrine, we say that the canonization is for, and a saint is for a double I, intercession and imitation. So a saint is somebody who we need to imitate because it's somebody who before us followed Jesus, followed Christ, and is a friend. So it's somebody who we can talk to when we are in trouble, when we need something. And that is the intercessory aspect of a saint. So really canonization, as you said, George, is not for the person who is a saint, is for the church, is for us, because we need that model to follow Jesus. And somebody could ask, why so many saints in the world? In the church, do we really need so many saints? Yes, because we need many friends. And so every friend is really a model for something, is a friend for something. So that's why I think we really need saints in the church, and we need different saints, because we need a halo saint, we need a saints who were more involved with justice, more involved with charity, more involved with hope, all of the virtues that can show us how to reach our personal holiness. So that's how I would feel to respond to this big question. And thank you, George, for what you said.
Thank you, Emanuele. And we certainly need friends. We certainly need friends.
That the two eyes there, I find I've not heard that before, and I find that very helpful, right? Intercession and imitation, and I think that's very nice. As you were both speaking, I'm reminded of Pope Francis's exhortation, Gaudete in Exaltate, where he talks about holiness is not swooning in mystic rapture, but connects it to the Beatitudes and connects it to this Christology that is in the works of mercy. And obviously, we see Dorothy. Many of us will see Dorothy there very clearly. So, as we look at the specific case of Dorothy, right now, this month is celebrating a special month, and the Dorothy Day Guild, we're seeing this or inviting people to take this as the beginning of a year because it's the 125th anniversary of her birth. We've had a lot of exciting things happening over the past few weeks. George and I and others were involved in this ferry launch in New York City, new ferry. All sorts of other events have been happening in different places. But George, can you maybe describe what's been happening in the diocesan phase? Because last December, there was this big milestone. A number of us here on this call were together in St. Patrick's Cathedral as we sent off a whole bunch of boxes across the ocean. And what happened to get to that point? What happened in the diocesan phase? And what were some of the challenges that you faced? And what were some of the unexpected blessings that you might have encountered as we went across in developing this phase?
Well, Kevin, when I started thinking about this, I could probably go on for a week, but this was an enormous process. And it was enormous because Dorothy was so prolific as a writer. And all of those writings had to be looked at and studied and documented. I remember the moment when we were getting ready to take 34 boxes of materials. Emanuele was there, and we had to seal each box with melted wax. We wrapped them in ribbons and melted the wax. A few people burned their hands as part of this process. And at one point, we kind of had trouble with the wax, so we had to use crayons. I don't think we want the Vatican to know that we melted some crayons, but it was such a moving moment because those boxes contained all her published works, letters and journals that were handwritten and transcribed by Marquette University, and then transcribed from the written to typewritten by 100 volunteers. This was an enormous undertaking, and at some point maybe we can talk about the effect that had on people's lives. We had reports of the Historical Commission, a biography, reports from over 20 theological censors, all the canonical acts, biographical documents. We had to get her arrest records, if you can imagine the search that took. So there was we had expert witnesses and also eyewitness, people who knew her. About 50 of those different witness testimonies all had to be transcribed. And in addition, all this had to be done in a canonically acceptable way. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking on December 8th, we talked about the laborers in the vineyard, and there were so many people who participated in this. There was the advisory committee. There were archdiocesan officials who were critical to helping us complete this work. Catholic Charities staff. There was an enormous blessing in the process itself. And again, I look to the people. There were people so touched by this canonization process. And again, I think there were moments. I have to particularly mention Jeff Corrigan. I know Jeff is on the call today. Jeff coordinated just take the 100 volunteers that we had. Each of them had to receive some part of the letter, some part of the diary, and transcribe them. Someone had to then review them. We had help from the Jesuit, the Ignatian Volunteer Corps to help with that. The Ignatian Volunteer Corps helped us find certain documents. So it was an incredible effort of people. And finally, on December 8th, we had all the boxes ready to ship. We had a wonderful moment, a mass in the cathedral with Cardinal Dolan. The final acts were completed. And when the phase was finished, the cathedral broke into a thunderous applause, an applause that I will never forget, that just kept rolling and rolling. And it made me think back to shortly after Dorothy's death, when Terence Cardinal Cook had a memorial service in the cathedral. I think 1984 probably, when he said, he walked down after the mass into the people and said, I may not have agreed with everything Dorothy Day said, but I believe we had a saint among us. I wasn't there, but people who were there said there was an odd silence that filled that cathedral when he made that statement. People knew it in their hearts, they felt it, but the joy that was expressed was silent. And December 8th, it was loud and thundering, and it kept rolling and rolling. I remember after the December 8th, I went back to Catholic Charities, and all the boxes were returned to a room. And I sat there in the room and thinking about the past 20 years. And I wasn't sure if I was feeling kind of just numbness or peace, but there was an enormous, wonderful feeling of an incredible accomplishment by all parts of the church, all people working together. I'll remember that moment. I think Emanuele and Waldery, who's the Roman postulator, remember those moments that we shared together at that time. I have to say, though, when we finally shipped all of the boxes to Rome, the 34 boxes, we were on the loading dock of Catholic Charities. So a lot of the romance and beauty of it had kind of dissipated. And this very old dented DHL truck pulls up, and we take these beautiful boxes and put them in the DHL truck. But we were very pleased to hear all the boxes arrived in Rome. So.
Of course, one of the unique challenges of Dorothy is she wrote quite a lot and kept a lot of diaries, and she published quite a lot. And so that may make her unique. I don't know, Emanuele, if other saints have written as much as her in recent years, but it's a lot more work on this. Yeah.
Only great saints. It's a lot.
So, you know, one of the things that we've encountered in this process is many people, for various reasons, who love Dorothy are not always so excited about the cause of canonization, right? For some, it's a concern over the costs involved. For others, it's a worry that by making her a saint, they might in some ways domesticate her or tame her message or tame the gospel or pigeonhole her into some other social issue. George, do you have any response, and then Emanuele too, maybe about as to how would you respond to someone who raises concerns over some of those questions?
So the first thing I would say, those are legitimate concerns. And in fact, those concerns were expressed in that first meeting with Cardinal O'Connor that I talked about. People raised the question of cost. Why is this money not being spent on people who are poor? How will Dorothy's legacy remain true? How can we be sure that it isn't co-opted in some way? And then the third issue that was raised, Cardinal O'Connor told people, this is a church process. And that has to be understood because there are going to be demands made canonically by the church, which people will need to be able to navigate. So in terms of the cost, I suspect that within a couple of years, we'll probably cross the $1 million mark. And that seems like a lot of money, and it certainly is. When you think about the 20 plus years that we've been working, and if you think about how the benefit of Dorothy being a saint over the millenniums that'll follow, perhaps that cost gets reduced. But from the beginning, we have tried to raise money from people. Again, we've had a small donor campaign, a Loaves and Fishes campaign. We've tried to reach the people who were from the grassroots. This money has not been taken from the poor. It's from people who are poor. It's been directly for this cause. So we feel that we've kind of addressed that in some way. I have to tell you that the amount of voluntary contributed services that have been given to this cause by the archdiocesan officials, my job, my work with the Guild has been subsidized by Catholic Charities and our office helping the Dorothy Day Guild. The 100 transcribers that I talked about, our historical commission, the 20 or so theological censors, all of that was not compensated. The costs that have been compensated are mainly for a staff person. So my answer would be yes, the costs are legitimate. It's a legitimate concern. We have been intentional to try to stay in the spirit of the Dorothy Day by keeping costs down. And we have done an awful lot that has been non-compensated for this. In terms of her legacy, again, a legitimate concern. We think about how Martin Luther King in some way has been minimized in terms of we have these very nice volunteer charitable things that we do on Martin Luther King Day, which are all valuable and all important, but we lose the radical notion of his vision. I think the same danger exists for Dorothy, but I believe there are some things which will militate against that. One, I'm confident that the case that went to Rome truthfully contains her legacy, both her love for charity and her love for justice, her love for peace, her love for community. The biography that was written by the Historical Commission, that Historical Commission included Robert Ellsberg and Pat Jordan. I think the continued presence of the Dorothy Day Guild and our attention to keeping people on the Guild who are in touch with the Catholic worker, who are Catholic workers, will help sustain that message. And finally, I think the Catholic worker movement is a great guarantor that the truth of her message continues, because in the action of their lives and what they are doing, the longer that they're a presence in the society, the longer there will be that conversation between her legacy and the Catholic worker. So I think they are legitimate. I think we need to be watchful, but I'm confident that we can do the best we can. I said to my wife this morning that Francis of Assisi is always pictured with a bird bath or something of that nature. But we reflected, well, the emphasis on his love of nature and nature's love of him certainly is a window on some of the ecological issues that we're facing in our world right now. So in a sense, we need to be vigilant, but we need to leave it in God's hands as well as to how that message is preserved.
Great, thank you. And I know I think this is a good sequence to ask Emanuele to share with us what's happening now and what's happening next. And I know you have a presentation, and I'll just remind everyone, if you have specific questions or comments or concerns, you can put it in the chat, but we'll also leave room in a few minutes for people to also take the floor. And we have a number of participants on this call who have been actively involved in this process. So, Emanuele, what has happened now that these boxes have gone in this dented DHL truck and have gotten to Rome, and where are they, and what is the next steps? And I think you have a presentation to maybe help to lead us through this.
Yes, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, George. I would like to highlight two issues on what George said. The first thing, as we will see, is the number of people involved in this cause. So that's what also contribute to the costs. And the second thing, as I said, the canonization is really not just for the person, it's for the church. So I think we have, as faithful, a moral obligation to do that, to present Dorothy to the world in the light of the church and with the canonization. So just to highlight these two aspects. Thank you, George, for your answer. So I would like to share my. Can you see it? Kevin is.
Yeah, we see your desktop. There we go. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And I would like to start with this, George, the boxes that you were talking about.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful.
Yes. This was the night of the 7th of December. We had 151 volumes, all wax sealed and so on. And I will never forget in my life, honestly, what happened on that night. And I think I shared this with you, George, and I shared with Valerie, and Valerie shared this with some of the members there. It was, I think it was really the end. So we packed everything, and everything was there. And I remember we were switching the lights off, and we were closing the door where these boxes were. And I remember George said to me, I had a kind of twofold feeling. One is peace, and one is concern, like the concern to leave everything here, and the awareness that everything is finished now. But actually, not everything is finished. Everything is starting from now. So I will remember that conversation with George, and I shared with Valerie. And this was the 8th of December, so our big celebration that George were referring to. And this was the last moments of the sealing of the box. And Cardinal Doran, I remember he was very willing to walk this box. So he was keeping on asking, so should we go on now? Should we seal the boxes? And finally it happened. So what I will show in this slide is what happened from the moment when you shipped the boxes until today. And I will share publicly a good step of the cause, which is really, an important step on the cause. So when everything was shipped to Rome, the first thing that happened in Rome was the opening of the acts. The opening of the acts is a solemn ceremony, which is done at the presence of some officials there at the dicastery, where they make a preliminary research that everything is done canonically. This is very preliminary. After the opening of the acts, there is the binding of the acts. So whatever you have seen in those boxes are now into white, big volumes of the cause. We have 151 volumes. These volumes were afterwards studied on the validity of the cause. So the dicastery is very precise, is very strict, and they want to be sure that every canonical step has been done during the diocesan phase. So this is the study of the validity. And finally, the dicastery issued the decree of validity. And this happened this week. So it's very recent. So it's another, point to thank God that we have reached this point. So the diocesan faith has been approved in its juridical issues, in its juridical aspects. So praise the Lord. So what happens now? The next phase is the appointment of the relator. The relator is a key role at the dicastery. As I explained to Kevin, to George, to David, we should imagine the relator as the professor who guides a doctoral thesis, because this is what we really need to do, to write a doctoral thesis about Dorothy, about her heroic virtues. We need to prove to the Pope, finally, that she exercised in her life heroic virtues. So the relator is this first role that is appointed there at the congregation and who will follow Dr. Hilgeman in the writing of the Positio. So what comes next is the drafting of the Positio. Somebody of you could ask, what is the Positio? The Positio is this thesis that I was talking about. It's a big volume, should be around 500 pages, where we need to show that, again, Dorothy exercised her heroic virtues. So the Positio is the final document where we have a summary of all the acts of the inquiry, and that will finally be presented to the Pope. And the Pope will decide on her heroic virtues according to this Positio. Then there is the imprimatur of the general relator. The general relator is the one who overview all the relators, and he gives his nihil obstat. He says, okay, the Positio could be printed. And finally, there is the printing of the Positio. You will see in the picture, and the Positio is now ready for the study on the merit. You remember the study on the validity has been done before. They have approved the validity, and now we start with the merit, so with the content of the Positio. The first step is very important, but it depends on the dicastery if to move forward with this or not. The first step is the gathering of the historical consultants. 6 are involved, and they need to prove, to say if everything that we have done with the Positio and with the gathering of the proofs is correct on the historical basis. I said that this phase could take place or not, depending on the dicastery. So only when the Positio will be drafted, will be printed, the dicastery will decide if to proceed with historical consultants or not. But for sure, this is the final Positio, the red one. But for sure, the Positio should go to the theological consultants, and they are 9. And the theological consultants need to judge whether Dorothy exercised her virtue or not, and whether she could be presented to the church as a model or not. There are 9 theologians, and to move forward to the next step, at least 6 should give an affirmative judgment. Okay, so 2/3 must be in favor of proceeding with the cause. Then the Positio goes to the cardinals and bishops that are members of the dicastery for the congregation for the causes of the saints, and they will finally decide again if the cause is worthwhile to go on or not. And finally, the Positio will go in front of the Pope, and the Pope will decide if proceed with recognizing her heroic virtues. At this point, Dorothy, hopefully, God willing, should be declared venerable. So once the decree on heroic virtues is published, Dorothy will be recognized in the church as venerable. So just keep in mind, maybe you all know this, but before becoming a saint, there are 2 other steps. The first is venerability, and the second is to be blessed, the beatification, okay? And then only at the end, Dorothy will be a saint. So at this point, Dorothy hopefully will be venerable. Now, I've prepared something, Kevin, on miracle. I don't know if this is the right moment, or I don't know.
Yes, maybe there was one question, technical question before moving on, that from Jeff Corrigan. Of the 15 consultants, how many may typically be women?
Well, they are appointed by the dicastery. So, well, very few, honestly, very few. In my experience, very, very few. The majority of the consultants, so the 6 historical and the 9 theological, especially the theologians are almost all of them are priests. That's very sad, honestly. But I need to say the truth. So this is what I saw in my experience.
Of course, one of the priorities, or one of the things many people point to about Dorothy's cause, is that she is a lay woman, a mother, and that might be part of some opening up of spaces that the Holy Father has already been doing in other dicasteries. So this, do you want to maybe go, since we're still talking about the Roman phase, if you want to talk a little bit more about the miracles? One of the questions that is in the chat is about the length of time. So just to keep that in mind. And then another question that just appeared is if you can just describe the difference between servant and God and venerable, because I think that fits into this moment.
Yes. So I will start with from this last question. So what is a servant of God? How can we describe a servant of God? A servant of God is a person on which a cause of canonization has been started. So actually, when we presented the petition to the church to start the cause, and the church accepted to start the cause, at that point, Dorothy was declared servant of God. Actually, it was not a declaration. It's something that happened ipso facto. So since the moment the church decides, she is a servant of God, okay? While the venerability is really the end of this process. So where Dorothy is officially approved as being somebody who exercised heroic virtues in her life. Okay, so servant of God is the beginning of the process. Venerability is the end. So this is the difference. Okay. So a servant of God, we are all servants of God, so to speak. Okay, we're all sons of God, we're all servants of God. But the venerability is really a juridical step. And it happens after, as you can see here, the decree on heroic virtues. It's an official declaration of the Pope. Because again, the last judge of all this process is really the Pope. So he's the one deciding. And then the second question was the time.
Maybe just a follow up on that. If and when, God willing, she is declared venerable, does that change any way in which people can relate to her in a spiritual? Does that open up possibilities for any sort of veneration or anything like this?
Okay, we need to be cautious, and the church wants to be cautious on that. Before the beatification, no official cult is allowed to a venerable or a servant of God, okay? Because for a cult, the church wants to be sure that there is a miracle that is approved by God that says, whatever the Pope has said on the heroic virtues, God has confirmed with the miracle, okay? So when the beatification is done, at that point, the church is sure that that blessed is really with God and is really a model. But before the beatification, no public cult is allowed. What do I mean by public cult? For example, a picture of Dorothy with a halo, or I don't know, another example could be to make some to take some relics and put it in below the altar. Those are signs of public cult that are forbidden until the beatification. But until the beatification, all of us as faithful has a right to have a spiritual relationship with Dorothy. So until that moment, the devotion, which is a private aspect of the cult, which is public, a devotion is allowed. Okay, so until beatification, devotion is allowed. After beatification, public cult is allowed. So I don't know if it's clear.
I think something important to clarify. So we are in the phase, God willing, in this Roman phase leading up to the venerable, hopefully. Yes. And then where do miracles fit into this? And that could move to your next phase. And I think we'll open up to more other questions from that.
Yes, okay. So hopefully at this point, we will be at the venerability. Then we need a first miracle for the beatification. And then we will need a second miracle to canonization. So that's where we are now. We are trying to reach to the venerability, but then we will need a miracle for the beatification. Okay, so until the miracle is approved by the Pope, no cult is allowed to Dorothy. So I don't know if this clarifies a little bit more, and then I could probably go on with the miracle, Kevin.
Yes, and the timeline more roughly.
That is a tough question, because there are many things involved. First of all, the amount of pages involved, which is objective. I mean, there are, as Jeff wrote in the chat, there are 2/3 of a ton of paper involved in this process. So part of the drafting of the positio will be reading, first of all, reading all these papers, and then studying and then writing a summary of these papers in order to show and to prove the heroic virtues of Dorothy. So speaking about time is very, as canonists, we never want to give a clear question, because otherwise we could compromise ourselves. No, but I could see at least 3 years from now, at least, to reach the venerability. But there are also many other aspects involved, because when you see here the historical consultants and the theological consultants, there is a line. I mean, there are many servants of God that are waiting to be discussed and to be judged, the cause. So it depends also on how many servants of God we have before Dorothy. So, and this is unpredictable at this point. So again, I cannot give a clear question, a clear answer to that. But of course, we're talking about years, at least 3 or more.
One more question before you move on to the specifics of miracles that emerged in the chat. That just to clarify at this stage, the positios remain confidential, correct?
100% confidential, and the church wants to be sure about that. And recently, a decree was given stating that the positio must be under secrecy for 50 years from the printing of the positio. After the 50 years, a positio can be consulted, but only with the permission of the dicastery for the causes of the saints. And the reason why is that there are many witnesses involved in these cases. So the church wants also to safeguard the intimacy, the privacy of whatever has been said during the process. So that's why the positio can never be made public.
And that question came from D.L. Mayfield, who has a new book out on Dorothy, which has gotten rave reviews from a number of friends. So just unruly saints. So why don't we talk a bit more? Why don't we get into the miracles? I say to my students that some of the saint making may seem often is the metaphor is used as sausage making, but I like to use the reference of pizza making, with the grandmother in the kitchen making the nice pizza. So what is the miracles here, and what do we need to be thinking of as in this process? Because this is an invitation for us who might be supporting this to continue to be involved.
Yes. So at this point, after the venerability, as I said, things are really in the hand of God. Because the miracle is, as I said, is the proof that God has approved what the Pope has said on that servant of God. So at that point, it's really God who decides whether the miracle will come or not. But on our side, we can contribute to the miracle because, as I said, Dorothy is a friend. So, and the intercessory power of Dorothy is that we can talk to her, ask her, challenge her, and of course, ask God through her, okay? So at this point, after the venerability, what we need, again, is a miracle for the beatification. Before I start, I would like to clarify that there are two kinds of miracles. What we call a technical miracle, which is very, very rare. I will give you an example. If somebody will fall from the 5th floor and nothing will happen, that is a technical miracle. But the second level of miracle, which is the most common, is the medical miracle, which deals with a healing from a disease. That is more common. That is what happens, most frequently, okay? So what I will talk about now is really the medical miracle, and I will leave the technical miracle to other, probably readings. They are very interesting, actually, but they are very rare. So what we need to prove in the medical miracle are two aspects. The first aspect is the theological element. The theological element needs to show that we ask the intercession of Dorothy and nobody else. So the theological aspect is really the theological level of the prayer. So to whom did we ask this miracle to happen, okay? And then the scientific element, which is actually the medical aspect of the miracle. So I will start with the theological element and with the prayer. In order to be recognized as a true miracle, the theological element must show that the prayer was antecedent, so it happened before the miracle, and that is quite obvious, okay? We cannot attribute to Dorothy a miracle if the miracle already took place and then we prayed to Dorothy, okay? That I think that really makes sense. And the second thing is that the prayer was direct to her and not to anyone else. Many times it happens that when we have a problem, which is also understandable, when we have a problem, we try to call up all our friends. So St. Francis, St. Catherine, St. whatever, St. Okay. No, the miracle should prove, in order to be attributed to Dorothy, that we only asked that favor, that intercession, through the intercession of Dorothy and nobody else. But the Church allows also that the Blessed Virgin could be prayed, and Jesus and God, because there is no conflict of interest between them and Dorothy, of course. Okay, so this is the theological element. Probably there will be other questions, but I will just switch to the next element, which is the scientific element. As I said, when we talk about healing, we need to be sure that it really happened on the medical level. Okay. The first thing to prove is that it was inexplicable according to the medical science, to the medical knowledge of today. And how can we prove that it was inexplicable? Because we need to look at the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the therapy used for that disease. The more the disease is terrible, so to speak, the more the disease is bad, the more the prognosis is poor. So if we know that for that disease there is no chance for the patient, the more the miracle would be inexplicable. And that makes sense, I guess. The second thing is that it must be instantaneous. A true miracle must happen now, in a time frame which is very, very short. Otherwise, the therapy, if there was a therapy involved and it takes some months or years, of course, that could be attributed to the therapy, not to the miracle, not to the intercession of Dorothy. The third aspect is that it should be complete. God makes things in a proper way. So if a disease is healed, God will never leave the person half healed, so to speak. The healing will be complete, okay? And the fourth aspect is that it should be lasting. Again, since God does everything in the proper way, the healing must be lasting. So if the disease will appear again after 1 year, it means that it's not lasting and that the miracle cannot be considered as such. Okay. So I would finish here because I've said many things. Many were very technical, so I don't want to get the people bored.
Thank you, Emanuele. I'll ask follow-up question to George, and I think there are some good questions that are emerging. One of the questions that emerged, just to follow up with you, Emanuele, is the question coming from someone who's worked a lot on Dorothy, Rosalie Riegel, is the question of equipollent canonizations, right? We have had some saints, I think Thomas More was one, Albert the Great, I think was another, people who have, some of this process has been skipped a little bit by the Holy Father. I think Pope Francis even did this recently with someone. Is that, I know this is maybe not something we could pray for, or I don't know.
No. The equipollent beatification and canonization is really an exception, an exceptional procedure. So it cannot be applied to Dorothy. It would be too technical to explain what is an equipollent canonization, but it applies only to those people whose cult and devotion lasted from 100 years before 1634, which is the year. I mean, it's too complicated, but by the way, the cult should be very, very long. I mean, a long-term cult. So it doesn't apply to Dorothy at all.
Great, thank you for that clarification. George, can you just describe what the Guild has been doing to collect some of these reports of graces and favors, which is one category, but also some potential miracles that have surfaced. And I know this is a space of collaboration that we have with this prayer network and with other groups of Benedictines and others that are out there. George, can you maybe just describe our subcommittee that we have, but also what we've been doing in recent weeks on this?
So we've been sending out to a variety of constituencies, asking people to pray for Dorothy's canonization and to let us know of any graces, favors, or potential miracles that they might be able to identify. We now have around 100 cases that qualify as graces and favors. That we don't have anything yet that reaches the level of miracle. Of course, these graces and favors, and the more that we have of them, it strengthens the positio. In fact, we're going to send to Waldery Hilgeman, the Roman postulator, all of these graces and favors that he will include in his positio to show the continuing prayer and interest of the people in Dorothy Day's canonization. But we are asking people, and one of the goals of the Guild, now that the diocesan phase has been completed, the canonical responsibilities of the Guild are less, where the Guild is taking on the responsibility of trying to identify a miracle. And I think Emanuele's explanation here is very helpful. One of the items that we learned is, and this is kind of sad, but often we hear about people who have experienced cancer, who are suffering with cancer, because of the fact that it's hard to determine if cancer is finally cured or how long it would be. It's not a great candidate. So what we need to do is continue to pray for people who suffer and to respond to them. They make wonderful graces and favors, though, if people have been cured. So we're looking for those miracles. I think, again, Emanuele has given us a pretty good framework in the way to think them.
And we are happily inviting people to share with us any graces and favors, even if they are not to the level of miraculous, where we can see how Dorothy is part of one's spiritual life. And so the Guild is collecting that. I know David and others on this call are helping to compile that. But I assume that if you're spending an hour of your weekend with us today, that Dorothy is an important part of your spirituality in some way, and that would be something for us to compile, right, George? And we have a subcommittee with a medical doctor and a nurse practitioner and other experts who are helping to just sort this to pass on to Rome. So would that be fair, George?
That's absolutely correct. And you can send this information to the Guild website, or if you wish to send it directly to me, I'll be sure that it gets to our committee and Dr. Joe Sclafani, who is heading our committee on this work. And if you need my email, it's george.horton@archny.org.
So we have about another 5, 6, 7 minutes, 10 minutes or so to bring in any questions from the floor that you might not have had answered, or comments. Again, there are lots of experts on this call and lots of people involved in Dorothy's life also on this call. Any questions or comments here? And George's email, by the way, to everyone is in the call. Yes, Joe.
Great songs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't become hits. This song.
Other questions or comments here?
Kevin, can I add something to?
Please, Emanuele.
The previous question, because the one that said about the equipollent canonization, I think there was a misunderstanding in what a equipollent canonization means. But now that I read the question, I guess that the person who wrote it really meant another thing. So, which is another possibility that the Pope used with John the 23rd, which is another way to canonize the blessed, in this case, without the second miracle. So probably that could be the question. So if we can hope that the Pope will dispense from the second miracle or even the first miracle. To answer this question, I would say no. The miracle is really something that the Church wants to continue to have as a sign of the God's presence in those processes. Okay, so there are very, very few exceptions when the Pope dispensed by the first or the second miracle, and one of these was really John the 23rd. Okay, so Pope John the 23rd, but that's really an exception, and I don't think that the Pope will apply to Dorothy in this case. So I don't know if this was really the question, not really the equivalent canonization, but I mean, just to clarify.
David has a comment, but I also just wanted to mention one comment that was made is that this month is the American Church celebrates Black Catholic History Month, and there is a lot of concern among many, including many Catholic workers, that there are no African American saints, and that there's a number of six, what we call the saintly six men and women of virtue who are there's efforts to try to push their causes, and I think one of the concerns is that we don't compete, that we don't take away energy from these other noble causes, which are especially needed in the U.S. Church at this moment. So I think that's something, and I don't know if either of you would want to respond to that question about the efforts of African American to be made to be recognized as saints.
Well, I share next door to my office is the Black Ministry Office of the Archdiocese of New York, and they are working very hard on Pierre Toussaint's cause, and it would be wonderful if both Dorothy and Pierre Toussaint could be approved together. Brother Tyrone Davis is leading that effort and is working very hard on that cause.
Great, David.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, that it doesn't just have to be a miracle that we're asking Dorothy's intercession for. Waldry Hegelman, or Dr. Waldry Hegelman, spoke a couple of times to the advisory committee, that really it's the small favors and graces that we should feel comfortable asking Dorothy's intercession for. And I like to use this example. A lady wrote me, and she said, my family as a gift gave me a puzzle with the photo of the family. You know how they do that. And she says, I was putting the puzzle together and there was one piece missing. And so she said, I prayed to Dorothy to help me find that piece of puzzle. And she said, I searched everywhere in the house for 2 days. And on the third day, she said, I was sitting back down in the puzzle and the puzzle piece was directly below on the floor. And she says, I looked there a million times. And she said, is this an answer to prayer? And I said, sure. I mean, so I think anything, we should get in the habit of, like Emanuele said, that Dorothy is our friend, and ask for her help in little things, big things, everything in between.
And David, I think we've also mentioned that we recorded a favor of a woman who wrote and thanked Dorothy for her son finding an apartment in New York City. And that was another what we considered great event. So you're absolutely right. It shows that we are in tune and thinking and asking Dorothy for favors. So you're absolutely right.
And I remember that story when somebody asked, but to put a little more detail to that, it was finding an affordable apartment in New York City.
That's right.
And when they found it, we said, yeah, that's a miracle. That must be a miracle.
Yeah, really.
Kevin, could I make one comment? I'm thinking about where we go from here, and certainly we'd be supporting Waldry and Emanuele and what they're doing in Rome. One of the challenges, I think, for us, and it kind of goes with making sure that Dorothy's legacy remains truthful. There's been a natural kind of interest in keeping Dorothy within the usual suspects. And I think we've got to figure out how to get beyond the constituencies who are already supporting her and get into different places where people who might not know her as well, but once they know her, they begin to have maybe some change in their lives. And, you know, I remember getting a call one time from the Catholic War veterans, and a wonderful lady on the other end of the phone, wonderful woman, said, we want to give an award for Dorothy. And, you know, and I said to her, I said, oh, that sounds wonderful. Do you know much about her? And when it came out, she knew a few things, but she certainly didn't know Dorothy's opposition to war and her pacifism, again, which is so relevant today. But I said to her, well, let us come in and meet your veterans. Let us come and talk. But she never got back to me. And there have been many things like this where we really have to be thinking about how do we carry this message to people who might not be as attuned as this wonderful group of people who have been working on this cause, but may be open. The ferry is a wonderful thing. If we think of the decades, this ferry is going to carry thousands of people who are going to read the plaque that talks about Dorothy and quotes Pope Francis, where he says that she worked for the cause of the poor and the oppressed. That's going to mean a lot, but we need to be able to widen our message.
And that, George, if I can just say, and David was inviting us to do a little pitch for the Dorothy Day Guild, is one of the goals of the Dorothy Day Guild to not just to talk about Dorothy and the cause for sainthood, but how the gospel is relevant in this particular moment and how Dorothy understood that question with the works of mercy, with pacifism in her totality. So that is, more information on the Dorothy Day Guild website, you can go there. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's a hand up. Mr. Diaz, is it? Or Jeffrey, yes. Please.
Yes, hello everyone. Nice to see everybody together. I wanted to share, my mother, this woman was named Eileen Fantino. And she wrote for the Catholic Worker many, many years ago in the 50s and 60s. And I grew up learning about the duality you talked about pacifism and anti-poverty. And as you were just speaking, I was thinking about, people like Dorothy and other Catholics who were radical, really. You're living in two worlds, right? So you have the church and you have the community and society. And I was just wondering and thinking out loud, if I might, about really it's a gospel, right? It's kind of like a gospel, putting forward in churches across the country, Dorothy's message and recognizing that, and that might spread the word, as you talked about before, to people who don't know her, Catholics who don't know her. Catholics still don't know that aspect of the Catholic Church. And to many people who have left the church, that kind of message is, I think, very powerful. I teach and I often talk about people who've turned away from understanding the influence of religion of all kinds in people's lives, and that somehow has been captured by one segment of society. So anyway, I just thought that was something to put out there. And I wanted to share something, George, I think you mentioned about, and others, and David, little things, right? So I want to share a little thing with you, okay? And it's physical, maybe someday to be a relic. This is literally a veil given by Dorothy to my mother at my baptism. And it's a treasured family heirloom. I lost my mother over the summer, and Dorothy was a huge part of her life. And she was a teacher, she was an activist, she was worked in the community in East Harlem. That's how she met my dad. And her note to my mother, it says, "Dear Eileen, here is an extra black veil you might use now that you are a mother. Wear it with my love, Dorothy." So a small act.
Jeffrey, thank you for that. And the point you make about Dorothy's appeal to people who may have fallen away or left, I think is so critical because she is so human that we can relate to her. We know she suffered, we know the struggles she went through, and we know how tightly she held to the gospel. So I think your point is so important, that she carries something to people who might be alienated, might be separated out. So thank you for that.
You're more than
Anyone
welcome.
else want to share anything before as we wrap up? I just on the physical side, Manhattan College has just opened up a new, we're formally going to launch it in the spring, a Dorothy Day Center for the Study of Social Catholicism. And part of that is to have a display to educate people in the wider community on Dorothy's life. So I think we need to get more of these out there, more of these stories out there. There are others on the call who have been involved in the cause, and maybe they want to share, or there's a question also in the chat, David, and maybe you'll be able to address that about the Benedictine involvement. But are there others that maybe want to jump in?
Well, I'll go first. So Kathy Bell put a question in the chat. I wonder whether Benedictines and Oblates in particular have joined Dorothy's cause in a formal or informal way. And the answer to that is yes, in an informal way. And actually this event today is the third of a series that was designed and aimed at the Benedictines and Oblates in appreciation for their support for her cause. And our prayer calendar of the Dorothy Day Canonization Prayer Network, almost half of the groups that have committed to a day of prayer a month for the cause are either Benedictine communities or Benedictine Oblate chapters. So yes, very much so, very, very much in terms of prayer support from the Benedictines.
Right. And many of the Benedictine communities are strong supporters of the guild's effort, which is nice to see. Are there other comments? We will. One thing the Dorothy Day Guild will be doing in the next few weeks as part of this Jubilee year, we will be relaunching our novena for the cause and with Dorothy, and that will be taking place between the date of her death at the end of the month and the December 8th feast day, which obviously was an important day for her second conversion, as some people put it. David, you want to wrap up with the video and some other comments?
Well, first of all, I'd really like to thank Emanuele and George and Kevin for a wonderful discussion, wonderful explanation of the cause and what happened, what took place, what got finished, what it looks like going forward. So thank you for this very informative event. As I mentioned a little bit ago, this is the third and last event in a series on Dorothy Day and the Benedictines. And last week I described one way of getting involved in the canonization cause through the work of our organization, the Dorothy Day Canonization Prayer Network. You can do that by joining, praying for those who are seeking Dorothy Day's intercession. And also you can send in requests for prayers. And let me see if I can just enter a couple of, let's see, did that go in? I can't tell. What should I do?
Waiting for you to hit enter.
Oh. Okay, there's a couple of references there if your group wants to join our prayer calendar. And then also if you have a request, you'd like to go on our request page. In addition to thanking Emanuele and George and Kevin, I want to thank John Abalon, who's sitting to my side here. John has conducted these sessions, these last 3 sessions, has done all the technical work, and has put together recordings that are being posted at www.oblatewebinars.org. So if you want to watch this recording or the previous 2 recordings, by mid next week, we'll have this recording up. But again, I want to thank John so much for his help and assistance. Okay. But I'd also like to emphasize, and Kevin brought this up, really like to invite you or that are attending today, or those who will be watching the video later on the recording, to consider joining the Dorothy Day Guild. The more guild members we have, the better it looks for our cause. It shows more widespread support for her canonization. That counts for a lot, right, Emanuele, I think? And so we ask you to consider joining the guild. And it's a $25 annual membership, which helps cover some of the expenses. And as a member, you get a periodic update and any guild newsletters that are produced in the future. So we would like you to do that. Maybe, Kevin, can you put something in the chat about, there's a membership?
Done, David. Yeah, already done.
All right, okay, very good. All right, so now to close, I'd like a closing prayer, and please be patient with me these next couple of minutes. I can do some screen sharing. We'll put up the prayer for the canonization of Dorothy Day. We'll unmute everybody, and we will recite the prayer together. And immediately following the prayer, I'm going to play 2 minutes of a video interview of Dorothy Day, taken from the Christopher Show, probably back in the late 1960s. So there's about a 2-minute clip I'd like to show so you can see her in her own words. She starts off talking about how Peter talked her into starting the newspaper and what that led to. So let me try to screen share the prayer. Praying together for her canonization. All right, so now let me screen share this video with you. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and God bless everybody.
And he came to me because he read articles that I'd written about the social order and suggested we start the Catholic Worker newspaper.
What was your first reaction when he came with this idea?
My first reaction was that I'd like nothing better than to, I think it's the ambition of everybody who's been in journalism to have their own paper, to start a paper, but I was very dubious about the funds. But he said in the Catholic Church funds were never necessary, you just needed to start. And we found it worked that way.
Well, you began with the Catholic Worker, the newspaper, but this got you into all sorts of other involvements with people.
We began talking about what makes for peace, and that is the teaching in the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and so on. And to take them literally really meant that you began practicing the works of peace rather than the works of war. And the works of war are the exact opposite of the works of peace. Feeding the hungry when we are destroying crops, and sheltering the homeless when we're destroying villages, wiping out cities. It's all the way through, right down the line, the opposite. And Christ proposed, certainly, that the work of the Christian was the works of mercy. And he laid it down as commands, not counsels, in the 25th chapter of St. Matthew.
There's no better way to get into trouble than to try to make peace, is there?
I always say if you start praying and saying, Lord, what will you have me do? Prayers are answered, and you find yourself doing a lot more than you ever thought you were going to do.